Once I met a girl lost in a book, dreaming the past. Follow, she said, and jumped in a page. She smiled and she asked. Walked to Glenfinnan, waited with Charlie. We drank an old leith, we were toasted by Robbie. We stood as they signed in our broth at the Abbey. She took me to places that I never thought you could see.
Hi, and welcome to the fourth episode from Random Scottish History for Independence Live. Today we're going to be talking about how the Arthurian and Merlin mythos seems to have taken part quite substantially within Scotland rather than just Wales and England, as many of the stories would have you believe. There has been a lot of research into these things by notable historians and authors in the past, and the conclusion they've come to is a fairly sound one to my mind, which is why I thought we'd get into it today. So, what is the Arthurian Merlin legend? Like the unicorns, it really actually depends on who you ask, where, and at what point in time, because this is a legend that has evolved over the centuries and been added to in a great amount by varying ancient authors. So the story itself begins in the 4th century. Before Arthur's born, Merlin's already been on the go. He is brought to Vortigern's court. Vortigern is a tyrant, and Merlin helps to dismantle his court. He then sets about fulfilling a prophecy of Arthur as king by bringing Arthur into the world. And this is done by his ability to bring Uther Pendragon, who's king at the time, to Igraine, who's the Duke of Cornwall's wife. And by her, Arthur is born, their illegitimate son. And Uther Pendragon dies by poison, because apparently he didn't have a unicorn's horn to hand, and he left the throne empty. So Merlin takes Arthur to Excalibur, which is stuck in the stone, and the prophecy is that whoever can pull this sword from the stone is, by dint of that fact, now king. So Arthur does this. Merlin sets about educating him as a foster father. He brings him up to be a righteous ruler who is solely out for the benefit of his people and country. And to that end, they create his court based around the round table. So he had a lot of followers, but a select few became knights, and they would sit around this round table, meaning there was no head, no leader. Everyone had equal voice, equal say, and equal importance around Arthur's round table. Merlin was an inherently good character. He wanted the best for people. He despised evil, which is despite his origin as apparently the son of a demon and a nun. So he was almost an anti-Christ character who was supposed to have ended up evil and working on behalf of his demon father, but instead took on the characteristics of his devoutly religious mother. It really set the story up as one of good countering evil, which was a significant trope in the medieval era. We're told that his demonic side is why he was able to use magic to his benefit, but also his renunciation of evil meant that he gained the power of prophecy from God, the higher power. So this last gift of prophecy was invaluable to Merlin with regards battle strategy and being able to avoid pitfalls for Arthur during his reign. So despite his illegitimate conception through adultery and being half demon, he isn't taken as anything but a good and heroic character throughout the story. And we can see that without Merlin, there would have been no Arthur, and therefore no victorious battles, no intrepid quests for the Holy Grail, etc. And the histories would have played out in a completely different way. The side stories that include characters like Galahad, who, like Merlin, was an illegitimate yet super devout and godly personage. Despite being a product of adultery between Lancelot and Guinevere, Lancelot being Arthur's best friend and Guinevere being Arthur's wife, Galahad ended up as keeper of the Holy Grail after this quest. This betrayal spells the end for Arthur and his court, which comes shortly after the Grail's arrival into Britain. The revelation of Lancelot's betrayal and infidelity is made known. Due to a strength of honour, he sentences his wife to death, and Lancelot tries to save her, but he's convinced by Mordred, who in some stories is his illegitimate son, in some it's his nephew, to pursue Lancelot into France in an attempt to obtain justice for Lancelot's infidelity. And while they're in France, Mordred takes the opportunity to spread about the news that they've actually both died there and that he's now the king. So he expels all of Arthur's knights of the Round Table, supplanting them with his own minions, and recreates the court and becomes a real tyrant. Arthur comes back to Britain to find that everything has changed for the worse, and that leads to his final battle in Camelon against Mordred's army, and he fails in that endeavour. Merlin is said to have been severely mentally affected by this end, the death of all the men that he knew, his king, and he apparently went on an extended solitary wandering, which ended, as we'll see. So this is a brief synopsis on purpose because there are so many variations of this story. There are so many additions and variations and recreations of this myth in different forms that to include every single aspect would be a labour of love that would take far longer than the hour we have here. The French were particularly enamoured with the Arthurian legends, and it seems to have begun with their medieval authors. Geoffrey of Monmouth also wrote his Historia Regnum Britanniae about the year 1138, which elaborated on the Arthurian myth. Chrétien de Troyes, at the end of the same century, wrote his own version, but introduced the Lancelot and Guinevere story arc. Robert de Boron, at the start of the 12th century, then did his version, which then introduced Excalibur in the stone and Arthur's withdrawing of it, which made him king. In the late 15th century, Thomas Malory apparently wrote the first English version, though it was entitled Le Mort d'Arthur, or The Death of Arthur. Alfred Tennyson wrote his take on the Arthurian legends called The Idylls of the King in 1859. When we get into the 20th century, there have been so many versions in varying media. You'll all have likely seen The Sword and Stone, for example. So we're going to concentrate on Merlin, the character, and his varying incarnations. So the Glasgow Herald for the 4th of May, 1889 tells us that the controversy as to whether there were two Merlins is of no particular moment. Professor Veitch, this sunny-looking personage here, accepts the theory of the double identity. According to the story, the Welsh Merlin, celebrated by Spenser in The Faerie Queene and by Tennyson in The Idylls of the King, is thought to have lived in the 5th century and is said to have sprung from the intercourse of a demon with a Welsh princess. He was naturally a prophet and an enchanter, and also, we presume, a bard. Perhaps the right view is that being a bard, he was all the rest. The Caledonian Merlin is said to have flourished in the 6th century and to have been a contemporary of St. Kentigern, our own beloved St. Mungo. Merlin Caledonius was known as Merlin the Wild or Wild. The story, double or single, may have had a historic origin, but quite manifestly it is full of myth, whether viewed from the Welsh or Scottish point of view. If we could accept the semi-demonic origin of the Welsh Merlin, there seems no reason why he should not be the Scotch Merlin. He may have got into bad odour in Wales and thought it prudent to retire to Dromelie on Tweedside, a place admirably suited to a bard in exile. So there we're hearing that there's 2 Merlins, a Welsh one and a Scottish one, each from different centuries. But was it the same Merlin from the end of the 5th, who was then in Scotland from the start of the 6th? Or are they 2 distinct personages? An article by Arthur Grant in the Scottish Review of 1892 is an article that really lays this out in a wonderful fashion, but we're only just going to take a few excerpts from it here for our purposes. He says, there is now no doubt that the massive Arthurian tradition can be traced to Celtic sources, and particularly to the Cymric branch of the Celtic family. And accordingly, wherever we find traces of the Cymry, they are very similar traditions, diversified only by local circumstances. Thus, each of the 4 great divisions of ancient Cymric territory, Strathclyde, Wales, Cornwall, and Brittany, have their separate traditions of Arthur and Merlin, and their Merlin shrines. The Scottish pilgrim will find the Cymric bard's grave by the peaceful Tweed in the sweet vale of Dromelie. The Welshman goes to dragon-haunted Dinas Emrys, amid the fastnesses of Snowdon, or to the Minid Merlin or Merlin's Hill near Carmarthen. The haunt of the Cornish pilgrim would be Fairy Tintagel, or that mysterious tomb referred to in Sir Thomas Malory, where, to quote a quaint Scottish reference to the legend, that wicked woman closed him in a crag of Cornwall's coast. In Brittany, amid the giant stones of Carnac, or on that little island of Sienne, between Raz and Poisson, off the west coast of Bretagne, the faithful still look for the grave of Merlin. Truly, it is a tangled web, which the Romanticists have woven around the story of Merlin. Here, then, we have, generally speaking, 3 Merlins, the Scottish, the Welsh and Cornish, and the Breton. The first of these became known through time as the Scottish Merlin or Merlinus Caledonius. The second as the Welsh Merlin, Myrddin Emrys or Merlinus Ambrosius. The third as the Breton Merlin, Marthin or Marzin. The first I shall call the Merlin of history, the second the Merlin of tradition, and the third the Merlin of romance. So now we have 3 Merlins, and we can wonder whether these were 3 distinct people from history who maybe attained the title of Merlin. Maybe that was a title that had some kind of meaning to denote someone as being especially powerful or magical or prophetic. You know, we're man with the sunny demeanour, Professor John Veitch, in a preamble to his poem entitled Merlin of 1889, states, "The Merlin of this poem is Merlin Caledonius, known also as Merlin Wild and Sylvestris. He ought not to be identified with Myrddin Emrys or Merlin Ambrosius, who was the Vatus of Vortigern, and also apparently of Aurelius Ambrosianus, the man of Roman descent who superseded Vortigern in the Cymric supremacy and lost it again about 465 CE. This Myrddin Emrys was probably also the Merlin of Uther Pendragon and of Arthur, while the name of the latter is associated with Dinas Emrys or Fort of Emrys in the Vale of the Waters, Nant Gwenant. which circles around the rugged grandeur of the southern slopes of Snowdon. That of the former Merlin Caledonius is inseparably joined to the wavy, far-spreading and heather-streaked hills between which the Powsail burn makes its way to the Tweed and the Haw of Drummelier. Out of the two Merlins, the earlier and the later, the romancers of the 11th and following centuries formed a third or legendary Merlin. Now the personage appears as a vulgar wizard and soothsayer, master of the art of glamoury, to be finally overcome by a woman's wiles and kept forever in hopeless captivity. So there, Professor John Veitch is suggesting that Merlin was a real personage, but that there has been a myth created around him that's made him magical and prophetic, but that can be ignored as pure myth, I guess. So we'll focus on Merlin Caledonius, being the point of our investigation here. The People's Shirt Advertiser for the 9th of January 1892 states, "It seems at first sight singular that a wizard who is especially claimed as belonging to the Cymric or Welsh branch of the Celts should be so associated with the south of Scotland. But Merlin, like Arthur, belongs not so much to a district as to a race. And we must bear in mind that 1300 years ago, the distribution of the population in Britain was different as regards races from what it is now. Arthur is called the king of the Dumnonians, but there were two races in Britain so called. One occupied the southwestern peninsula of Britain, now known as Cornwall. The other occupied the greater portion of the middle lowlands of what we now call Scotland. That the people of these two far divided territories were of the same great family of Celts is obvious from the place names that still exist on the borders: Traquair, Trahenna, Polworth, Pinvala, and many others that closely resemble names in Cornwall. As likewise from such river names as the Tweed, the Teviot, and the Timma, all of which have analogues in Wales. The Cornish, like the Gallic tongue, is regarded by philologists as an older form of Celtic than the Welsh, and the fact that we find names in the south of Scotland that resemble names both in Cornwall and in Wales may be regarded as supporting the theory that it was the older or Gallic-speaking Celts who first occupied the country, and that these gave place later on to a second wave of immigrant Celts who spoke Welsh. Bearing this in mind, therefore, it is not difficult to understand how the mythologies of the Celtic race should be found embodied in the place names of the district so far apart as Cornwall and the Scottish borders. We have seen the tradition of Merlin's death, which Lord Tennyson has adopted for poetical treatment. That which relates to the death of Merlin the Wild or Merlin Caledonius is quite different, both as to the locality and the circumstances of it. From Broceliand, we are brought back to Tweedside, and instead of the wily Vivian with her woven paces and her waving arms, we have the sticks and stones of a rough band of ancient border shepherds. The latter story of Merlin's death is curious and must have been written by one who was familiar with the locality, as the nature of the ground at that spot where the wizard is said to have been killed is precisely such as the circumstances attending his death would lead us to expect. Moreover, it is just possible that the person to whom the name of Merlin Caledonius was applied may have been a real person, as the name given to him in life is Lalagan, and it is only Bower, in his continuation of the Scotichronicon, which he wrote so late as the 15th century, who seeks to identify this Lalagan with Merlin the Wild. It is possible also that the poems which are attributed to this Merlin the Wild may have actually been written by Lalagan. And on account of this poetical faculty and the mental aberration of his later years, the people may have come to regard him as a second Merlin, the one name in the course of time supplanting the other. And so instead of the place of burial being called after Lalagan, a name foreign to Saxon lips, it was reconsecrated with the more familiar appellation of Merlin's grave. In the life of St. Kentigern, better known in Scotland as St. Mungo, written in the 12th century, we read of a certain Lalagan or Lalagan who lived in the court of King Riderch as a kind of jester, but who after the death of the saint became very melancholy and began to utter prophecies which were rendered memorable by their realization. Bower, who connects him with Merlin the Wild, gives a different version of Lalagan's relations with the saints. So there it's telling us that This could very well have been a historically extant person by the name of Lalagan, who obtained the name of Merlin due to his character more than anything. Arthur Grant, again in the Scottish Review for 1892, tells us Druidism, which had well nigh disappeared among the southern Britons, still flourished among men of the north, as the Scottish Cymry were sometimes called. Many of the noble families proudly held to their ancient belief, and as Christianity crept in amongst them, the breach between Christian and pagan Cymry grew wider and wider. The chiefs of two ancient royal houses took opposite sides in the struggle, Rhydderch Hale leading the Christian and Gwendolew the pagan factions. Both appear to have been men of more than ordinary ability, and both are mentioned in the ancient triads of Arthur and his warriors. Rhydderch is one of the three generous ones, and Gwendolew is one of the three bulls of battle on the island of Prydain, Britain. Gwendolew was also called the father of songs, evidently in recognition of his patronage of the bards. With both sides also are associated the names of the two representative men of rival creeds, St. Kentigern with Rhydderch Hale and Merlin with Gwendolew. We now come to consider how our Merlinus Caledonius, magnified by the purple mist, the dusk of centuries and of song, became the great Merlin of tradition and romance. As time wore on, the unremitting attacks from Scots and Saxons began to tell on the little Cymric kingdom of Strathclyde. For a time, Stirling was the common march of the three races, and Holinshead tells us that on the old Stirling Bridge, the following couplet was carved: I am free march as passengers may ken, to Scots, to Britons, and to Englishmen. But in 756 CE, Rhydderch's capital of Alclyde, Dumbarton, fell into the hands of the Scots. Then Cumberland and Westmoreland were lost, and at last in 870 CE, the final exodus took place, when, in the words of Holinshead, the Cymry departed into North Wales, where they placed themselves in the country between Conway and the River Dee, out of which they expelled the Englishmen that were in possession thereof, and therewith they erected a kingdom there which they named Stradclwyd, maintaining wars against the English many years after. The great body of the Cymry, however, must have gone southwards to North Wales, and it was natural that they should carry with them their traditions or songs of the bards in which were preserved their nation's hopes and fears. It was their Arthur who had won the 12 battles. It was their Merlin who had prophesied a happier time in the future. A mystery to the world, the grave of Arthur, says an old Cymric poem, and deep down in the national heart there slumbered the hope that the mystery had some connection with their king's final triumph. Arthur, therefore, was their great king, and Merlin was his prophet. And although this connection between king and prophet existed only in romance, there was really only an interval of 31 years between Arthur's last battle and Merlin's, between Camlan and Aderant. It was natural, too, that the name should be finally localised in Wales. And by the 12th century, both the Welsh localisation and nationalisation of the Merlin myth was fully established. As to the manner of his death, we have again to fall back upon the Scottish Chronicon. It tells a tragic end to a tragic life. By the banks of the upper Tweed at Dromellier, or Dunmellar, as it was anciently called, Merlin was attacked by the shepherds of Meldred, a princeling of the district, and stoned and beaten to death. His body was then flung into the stream upon a sharp stake, on which it lay impaled. Villamarcus' short but graceful comment on this account is well worth quoting. It translates to, from the ancient Orpheus to the Celtic Orpheus, how many others have died in the same way. It is the eternal struggle of brute force against intelligence, sweet and sublime, inspired by heaven, whose kingdom is not of this world. At Dromellier in Peeblesshire, where the Powsill burn flows into the Tweed, a thorn still blossoms in the spring over the traditional grave of the Scottish Merlin, and there we too can sit in the shadow, looking upwards and around from that old thorn by the River Tweed to the green rounded hills of the borderland. We see a deeper meaning in Merlin's own words. Are not the buds of thorns very green, the mountain beautiful, and beautiful the earth? In Scottish literature, no doubt, his name has been almost entirely associated with his prophetic character. His prophecies linked with those of Thomas the Rhymer were, in the old days, household words to generations of Scotsmen, whilst his personality was lost in that final exodus of the Cymry from Scotland to Wales. Saxon historians necessarily knew little of the ancient British prince, prophet, and bard, but local tradition has preserved for 13 centuries the memory of his last resting place. The striking features of the histories of the Scottish and Welsh Merlins is seized upon and moulded to suit the spirit of the time, the spirit of medievalism. Even as Christ was both Son of God and Son of Man, born of a virgin, so Christ's victory over Satan could only be nullified by the birth of a being who was both son of the devil and born of a virgin. Such was the high keynote in which the medieval romance of Merlin was pitched, and the opening chapters describe how Satan's scheme for thus ruining mankind was attempted and how it signally failed. The child Merlin, who was to be his agent, was born, but all Satan's efforts were counteracted by the spotless purity of Merlin's mother. Merlin, endowed with the wiles of the devil, his father thus turns these very powers into factors for good instead of evil. Merlin is thus made the personification of a second victory of Christ over Satan, and the reader is prepared for the further development of Merlin's character from that of a pagan prophet to that of the advisor and friend of the typical Christian King Arthur. The Merlin of romance becomes a prophet founder of the Round Table and the originator of the most sacred of all quests, the search for the Holy Grail. Our sunny Professor John Veitch says again, the Caledonian Merlin is a sufficiently distinct historical personage. He was a son of Morvern, who was descended from Cúl Godebach, the head of one of the main royal lines of the Cymry. He had a twin sister, Gwendid. He was the friend of the prince Gwendolew, a lord or king of the north, and he was present at the decisive battle of Ardorid in 573 CE, when the contest lay between the pagan and Christian forces of the time. Merlin was on the pagan or losing side. After the defeat and the death of his leader Gwendolew, he fled to the wilds of Dromelli in the wood of Caledon. There he spent some years, reputed insane, probably only heartbroken, and despairing of the Cymric cause and his own fortunes, perhaps doubting the trustworthiness of his original faith or nature worship. Finally, he is said to have died at the hands, rather stones and clubs, of the herdsman of a princeling of the district, then incorporated in the kingdom afterwards known as Strathclyde and ruled over by Riddiff Hale, originally Lord of Lanark or Lanark. Merlin's grave is pointed out by tradition near the village of Dromelli, by the side of the Powsale burn as it joins the Tweed. There can be little doubt, looking to external and internal evidence, that this Merlin was the author of certain poems now preserved in the 4 ancient books of Wales, and that to him also are to be assigned portions of the Merlinian poems, of which there occur interpolations of a later date. So again, we're taking him as a distinct, extant historical personage, someone that actually existed in the past and has a history that we can refer to via his poetry, etc. The Scotsman, for the 3rd of November of 1868, tells us, in Geoffrey's legends, Arthur's lineage is deduced more immediately from Cornwall or the country of the southwest Britons, and his headquarters, when he is not going on circuit, are represented as generally somewhere in what is now southern England and Wales, at London, at Winchester, at Camelot, supposed to be Cadbury in Somersetshire, at Caerleon upon Usk. Accordingly, man or myth, he has been long a familiar possession of these parts of the island, and they would be loth to part with him. Of late, however, and from various quarters, there has been a good deal of argument to prove that the Arthurian legends are not indigenous to these parts, but have been imported into them by a literary process, and that the true Arthurian region, the actual birth ground of the legends, must be sought for farther north. In the romances, Arthur's circuit is so frequently northwards that next, perhaps after the famous Camelot, it is at a dreamy Carlisle that we think of him holding his feasts and jousts. In Geoffrey's legends, the amount of reference to the north is still more remarkable. It is against the Saxons of the north in the wood of Caledon, or here and there else in the present southern Scottish lowlands, that Geoffrey makes Arthur do most of his direct anti-Saxon duty, and if there is any part of his narrative where Geoffrey seems, in spite of himself, to be introducing a lump of positive historical tradition into his wilder legendary matter, it is where he follows Arthur in his expedition beyond these northern Saxons into the country of the Picts and Scots. He follows him from Alclyde or Dumbarton and all round Loch Lomond, not only giving the name of that loch, but lingering over the description of it and its marvellous islands where the Picts and Scots had taken refuge, and whence Arthur dislodged him. Then, as if to signalise the permanence of the impression of Arthur's presence in this part of Britain, he tells us how Arthur divided all the territory he had wrested there from the Saxons and the Picts into 3 kingdoms, which he bestowed on 3 brothers, relatives of his own. One of these kingdoms, the kingdom of Lothian, he gave to Lot, or Lothus, who had married his, Arthur's, own sister, and was the father of that fatal nephew, Mordred, by whose treachery Arthur was to perish at last. Apart altogether from books, the genuine Arthurian region of Britain seems to assert itself by the tenacity with which it has preserved Arthurian terms and associations to this day. What part of Britain is fullest of Arthurian names of places and of traces of an Arthurian cult or folklore older than all Anglic or Saxon tradition, and which even the weighty subsequent deposit of such tradition and centuries of custom in the English speech have not been able to obliterate? According to the English Arthurian Inquirer, Mr. Nash, not southern England, not middle England, not even Wales or Cornwall, but the northern borders of Northumbrian England and the Scottish lowlands south of the Firths of Forth and Clyde. Quite recently, under the title of Arthurian Scotland, there was published by Mr. J.S. Stuart Glennie a very curious and suggestive paper giving the results of his own perambulation of the region under notice in quest of Arthurian names of places and local Arthurian associations. He enumerated no fewer than 65 distinctly Arthurian spots found within the limits of his perambulation. There is Guinevere's grave, or the grave of Guinevere at Meagle, on the borders of Perthshire and Forfarshire, for it was a hapless woman's lot, it seems, to die far off among the Picts. There is also Merlin's grave at Drummelier on Tweedside. Ben Arthur at the head of Loch Long trumpets itself. In Edinburgh is the famous Myned Agnid, or Castle of Maidens, from Edinburgh exactly bisecting as it did the northern frontier of Arthur's British domain. The hero could gaze wistfully across the Forth into that Pictish haze and chaos in which Guinevere had been swallowed up and lost. And when he did so gaze, where would he be but on Arthur's seat? The Scots Magazine, for the 1st of February 1888, tells us that despite the minstrels of a later time who would fain carry Merlin off to Brittany, the natives yet point out the grave of the wizard by the Burn of the Willows, near where it joins the Tweed below Drummelier Kirk, and we know how death, as in the case of Ossian, ended a profound melancholy that closed around his spirit. In his last years, he walked with dreams in darkness, and he found a doom that ever poised itself to fall, an ever moaning battle in the mist, world weir of dying flesh against the life, death in all life and lying in all love, the meanest having power upon the highest, and the high purpose broken by the worm. Is there not something of the sublime in the vision of this grand pagan clinging to the druidic nature worship of his fathers, stifling the doubt that will present itself, choosing rather, like Ossian, to be in hell with his beloved kindred than in paradise with the pervert? The Glasgow Herald, for the 4th of May 1889, discussing Professor Beach, says that his notion, whether historical or not, is very interesting. St Mungo made a pilgrimage to the wilds of Drummelier to try and convert Merlin to Christianity. That the old bard was touched with the new ideas is probable, but like Ossian, whom St Patrick tried to convert, he relapsed into or preferred his old faith of nature worship. He, in fact, worships the sun. I worship thee, O sovereign of the sky, thy symbol of the God who is unseen. Inspirer thou of life and hope and joy, my pulses beat with thine. Merlin is as little understood on the banks of the Tweed as at Arthur's court. If the two Merlins are one, and the result is that he falls a victim to the boors and dunces of Drummelier, they call him wizard and devil's son, and of course they drown him in the Tweed. His body was buried near the junction of Powsail Burn with the river. The Peopleshire Advertiser for the 9th of January 1892 again delves into his death. They say it so happened that on the same day Lalagan, in the course of his wanderings, was met by the shepherds of a certain chief called Meldred at his place of Drumeldred or Drumelier, and these, probably regarding the wizard as the cause of calamity to themselves or their flocks, seized him and proceeded to stone him and beat him to death. At the last moment, the wretched man stumbled over a steep bluff or bank overhanging the Tweed, his body falling upon a sharp point of a stake, which had been stuck into a little fish stew in the water, and upon which he was impaled. This manner of death, it was found, corresponded with the prophecy which he had that day made, that he should die by 3 kinds of death, namely by stoning, by drowning, and by impalement. The high bank above the Powsail Burn at its junction with the Tweed corresponds with the description of that over which the wizard is said to have fallen. So we've seen how people have tried to make the case for Merlin having been an actual person from history, having actually existed. The Scotstoun for the 3rd of November 1868 says, if Mr. Skeen's investigation of the Arthurian tradition has yielded results that are to be taken as accurate or even probable in the main, the chance that he may have overstrained his ingenuity in particulars that need not delay our pleasure along with him in that accession of legendary importance which he vindicates for the country round about us here, all the country near and between our 2 South Scottish firths. How he has cleft back into the past for us and enabled us to see, as if glimmering through the cleft of vision of all this, our familiar region of plain, hill range, river and sea surge, removed back into a depth of antiquity, some centuries beyond our previous historic reach. Said I not, too, that for us in Edinburgh he had interpreted into quite a new significance that name of Arthur's Seat, with which we have all puzzled ourselves. No longer is the name a mystery by itself. It is the most prominent surviving fragment of a wider mystery that has melted away, but has left other fragments of it still recognizable. Back in that shimmering vision of our Firth-bounded region, 1,300 years ago, we see our mountain and its peak still venerable and picturesque and far visible as now in the very mist, and we find the reason of its name in the fact that all around it, thought and action as well as scenery, was then somehow Arthurian. This then is Arthur's land. The North British Daily Mail for the 2nd of January 1878 continues on that theme. The chapter on Arthur and the Arthurian legends is exceedingly interesting and contains information which will probably be new to most of Dr. Veitch's readers. He adopts the theory of Mr. Skeen respecting this famous semi-mythological hero and holds that Arthur was the leader of the Northern Cymry in the 6th century in their struggles for national independence against their Pictish and Anglian oppressors. He contends that Arthur's 12 celebrated battles, enumerated by Nennius, were fought in succession and in one region, that they represent a campaign, not a series of isolated struggles, and that the district in which this campaign was carried out was the kingdom of the Northern Cymry, now the lowlands of Scotland. The first battle, he thinks, was fought at the mouth of the small river Glen, which falls into the Irvine in the parish of Loudon. The second, third, fourth, and fifth took place in the region of Lennox near Loch Lomond. The sixth at Dunapace in Stirlingshire. The seventh in the wood of Caledon on the Line, a tributary of the Tweed. The eighth between the Heriot Water and the Luggate, tributaries of the Gala. The ninth at Alclyde or Dumbarton. The 10th at Stirling. The 11th at Edinburgh, and the 12th at Bowden Hill, not far from Linlithgow. 21 years after this last great battle, 537 CE, Arthur fell at Camlin on the Carron, fighting against his nephew Modred, the head of a mixed pagan party, Angle, Pict and Infidel Cymry, who was himself killed in the fight. In the chapter on Merlin, the famous wizard, Dr. Veitch has skillfully disentangled the real incidents in the life of this potent and mysterious personage from the mythical tales which in later ages gathered around him. He seems to have been a leader of the Britons, held in high respect for his learning and sagacity. He fought at the Great Battle of Arderid near Carlisle in 573 CE on the side of the defeated pagan Cymry. After this disastrous conflict in which his nephew fell, as well as friend and patron Gwendolen, the leader of the pagan host, Merlin fled to the upper district of the Tweed and passed the remainder of his life, reported insane, among the glens which sweep from the Dollar Law to the Broad Law, and from the watershed between the burns that flow northwards to the Tweed and those that run southwards to the Megget Water. There is no wilder or more solitary mountain land in the south of Scotland than these high-spreading moors. There is no scene which could be more fitly assigned to a heartbroken and despairing representative of the old Druidic nature worship, at once poet and priest of the fading faith, yet torn and distracted by secret doubts as to its truth, and not knowing well where his beloved dead had gone, or what was their fate in that mysterious spirit world he felt was above and around them. It was while wandering in these glens in the upland wilds of Tweeddale that a meeting is said by tradition to have taken place between the half-insane Cymric bard and Kentigern. While kneeling in solitary prayer in the wilds of Dromelie, the saint was suddenly confronted by a mysterious figure, weird-like and unearthly in look, who proclaimed himself once the prophet of Vertigern, Merlin by name, now in this solitude enduring privations. The Herald tells us that the truth is, however, that Merlin was more than the story imparts. Tennyson's idea is that Merlin was the most famous man of his time. Merlin, who knew the range of all their arts, had built the king his havens, ships, and halls, was also bard, and knew the starry heavens. The people called him wizard. It is clear from these words that Merlin was King Arthur's first lord of the Admiralty and chief commissioner of works. Probably he was sanitary inspector, if not also inspector of the meat market, and had ideas far in advance of his time. For instance, Merlin possibly desired to construct an adequate fleet for King Arthur, and the opposition may have made it so hot for him that he deemed it best to resign and come north. The Peopleshire Advertiser for January of 1882 says that the Battle of Arderid was that at which Ridder, by his victory over the pagans, established himself as king of Cumbria or Strathclyde, embracing within it all the petty Cymric tribes, and among them those who inhabited Tweeddale. If partial insanity befell Lulligan after his defeat at Arderid, it is possible he may have been allowed to wander about the king's court, as told in the life of Kentigern. It is equally possible that in the later stages of his madness, he may have taken to the forests and wilds, as narrated by Bower. Bower being the author of the Scottish Chronicon. Arthur Grant tells us again that at last the crisis came when the Christian and pagan forces met in the battlefield of Arderid in the year 573 CE. In this fratricidal struggle, the Christian army was victorious, and Prince Gwendolen himself was slain. Ridder Hale then consolidated the petty Cymric states into his kingdom of Strathclyde or Clwyd, with Alclyde or Alclwyd, Dunbarton, as his capital, and with Kentigern as primate in the See of Glasgow. Merlin's own poems show that he was present at this fatal battle, fighting on the side of his friend Gwendolen, and that after the battle he fled broken-hearted, if not altogether insane, to the wood of Celadon, where, if we are to believe his poems, he wandered about for 50 years. Apart from the Merlinian poems, there is an entry in one of the old chronicles, the Annals Cambriae, which connects Merlin with Arderid. Translated, it reads, in the year 537 CE, the war of Armtrid between the sons of Elifer and Gwendolen, the son of Caedin, in which war Gwendolen fell, Merlin became insane. Here not only is the death of Gwendolen chronicled, thus identifying Armtrid with Arderid, but the sons of Elifer above referred to are also mentioned in Merlin's poems as 7 heroes and as having been present at Arderid. As to the site of this battle, there is a curious chapter in the Old Latin edition of the Scottish Chronicon, which gives an account of a meeting between Kentigern and Merlin. Here Merlin is said to explain his connection with the Battle of Arderid. Translated, it reads, which was situated in an area between Liddell and Carvanalo. Carvanolo, now corrupted into Carwinolo, is simply the Latinized form of Caergwendolo in the city of Gwendolo, and not far from the Liddell and Carwinolo streams is the Ardorid of the poems, now called Arthurit. The battle was fought, therefore, near Carlisle, close on the borders. When all is over and the field of battle is left to the ravens screaming over the blood of the slain, there is the retreat across the wilds of Liddesdale into the recesses of the wood of Celladon, and to that part of the ancient forest which still bears a name hallowed by sorrow, the Ettrick Forest. In the Latin Scotichronicon, a Scottish source totally independent of and unconnected with the Cymric poems, we find Merlin described as, translated, it reads, the one who was commonly called Leilikin. Gwendid's pet name for her brother had thus become associated with Merlin long after its original meaning had ceased to be intelligible to the monkish chronicler. To return to Merlin himself, we have no direct evidence as to the exact date of his death. Holinshead merely states that he flourished about the year 570 CE, thus corroborating at least the date of the turning point of Merlin's life, the Battle of Ardorid, 573 CE. A Brevis Chronica attached to an old copy of Winton's Chronicle gives under date 605 CE. About this time, Merlin, the prophet of Bretagne, deceased with great penance. And the Scottish Chronicon states that Merlin and St. Kentigern died in one and the same year, which, according to the Annals Cambria, would be 612 CE. The implied date of the Avalano, as we have seen, would bring him down to 623 CE. Sometime, therefore, during the first quarter of the 7th century, may safely be considered as the period of Merlin's death. So there is another side to the argument that goes against the idea of there actually having existed, of course. The People's Shire Advertiser for January of 1892 tells us that this coexistence of traditional legends regarding Arthur and Merlin in places so widely separated is distinctly unfavourable to the claims that have been put forward for these men as being really historical personages. It is difficult to regard them as such. The Great Battle of Mons Bedonius or Baden Hill, fought 493 CE, is one with which Arthur's name is associated, but the historian Nennius, who professes to give the names of this and other battles fought by Arthur, lived some centuries after the date of that event, and our best scholars regard his compilation of so-called Arthurian battles as of doubtful authenticity. Whereas the Welsh historian Gildas, who was born in the same year as that in which the Battle of Mons Bedonius was fought, and who makes special reference to the battle, does not mention Arthur's name in connection with it, nor does he moreover seem ever to have heard of any military leader of the name of Arthur. If Arthur really lived and reigned and fought the battles attributed to him against the enemies of his country and his race, it is difficult to understand how an historian who lived during the same years and belonged to the same nation should have failed to give his life and deeds emphatic record. If we are unable to recognise Arthur as a historical personage, it is on similar grounds that Merlin too must be regarded as mythical, but a special difficulty crops up in the case of Merlin. According to Arthurian legends, Merlin was a man of great influence and great powers of necromancy long before Arthur was born, and according to the same cycle of legends, we find the wizard fighting at the Battle of Ardrid in 573 CE, more than 100 years later. And not only so, but the wizard is reputed to have wandered for 40 years among the hills that surround the sources of the Tweed and Clyde in a state of semi-madness in consequence of his defeat at Ardorid, thus extending his life to something like 170 years. The old legend writers were aware of this difficulty, and so, to get rid of it, were obliged to invent a second Merlin, the one who is said to have lived in Wales under Arthur's father, Uther Pendragon, and under Arthur himself. They call Merlin Ambrosius. The other, who is alleged to have lived in Scotland and to have fought at Ardorid, they call Merlin Caledonius. We have voluminous and highly wrought narratives of the wonderful deeds of both Arthur and Merlin, but these narratives are not earlier than the 12th century, and they possess the unfailing characteristic of all myth stories, that those writers who lived farthest from the time of the heroes are able to give the fullest details of their history and deeds, while the one historian who is contemporary with them is absolutely silent. So Arthur Grant, who really pushed for Merlin Caledonius, as we've seen, also states just how many fabrications were added by Geoffrey of Monmouth to the Merlin and Arthurian legends. One of the main ones being that the stones from Stonehenge had been magicked by Merlin from Ireland over to Salisbury Plain, where they are at the present day. Of course, we know now that the majority of the stone at Stonehenge comes from Welsh bluestone quarry from the Pressley Hills in West Wales, and that they could have been shifted from their original position to where they are now by glacier action or what have you. I'm quite happy to believe that Merlin and Arthur spent the majority of their time in Scotland. I'm quite happy to believe that the myths originated in Scottish areas. So despite the first authors of the Arthurian legends apparently having been those of the medieval French, I am strongly inclined to believe that their stories were influenced by battles that occurred in the Scottish lowlands in Scotland, that there was travel between these places, and Brittany is not so far from Britain, and the people travelled extensively, both for trade and other purposes. A lot of people emigrated and were forced out of positions, as we've seen the Cymry were forced into North Wales from the lowlands of Scotland. So these stories travelled with the people. So I'm quite happy to believe that they originated in Scotland and in the lowlands of Scotland for the main part. I don't know if I've managed to produce evidence that convinces you guys. And I don't know if these authors from history have managed to convince you of the fact that Merlin and Arthur's stories took place in the main in the lowlands of Scotland. But you can let us know, I guess, in the comments. I know from my own experience that I was brought up believing and seeing from the stories that it was an English-Welsh legend that didn't have very much to do with Scotland. But I know that my mind's been changed by the information that I've found. So we'll end here. I feel like I've tried to cram as much information into this as possible in the hour that we have. And we may see you for the next one. Take care.